Poor thing's up in her room now, crying her eyes out.
Oh, my. I did that once when I was younger and had a terrible time getting them back in.
Painter, sculptor, actor. Those are the words that Fred Gwynne would use to describe himself. But to the rest of the world, he was and ever will be Herman Munster, the 7-foot, green-colored, stitched-together alter ego he played on the beloved 1960s sitcom, The Munsters. And those differing views between he, the public, and even Hollywood would turn fame into a prison that would take over 30 years and a couple of youts for Fred to escape from. I'm Retro Ed from Do You Remember? And this is a look back at the struggles of Fred Gwynne, whose career was frequently put on hold due to the world's love for the Munsters. Before we go on, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like by hitting the thumbs up, and don't forget to subscribe so that you don't miss our next episode. By all accounts, Fred enjoyed a happy childhood, but that happiness would be torn away from him when he was only 8 years old. He was born in New York City in 1928 and moved around the country quite a bit due to his father's work as a stockbroker. He and his dad enjoyed a close relationship, which made it even more devastating when what should have been a routine sinus operation resulted in the man's death. In response, Fred retreated into himself, becoming withdrawn and more introspective. One outlet he found for his pain was through the sketches that he enjoyed drawing, a skill he quickly began to develop. Things didn't really get better until he entered prep school. He felt self-conscious that at 13 he was already 6'6". But in the end, that didn't matter. At prep school, he found himself genuinely happy for the first time in years. That happiness he felt came from the fact that he was enormously popular among his classmates, sang in the school choir, and continued to explore his passion for art. Fred may have been looking for direction following prep school, but he also felt he had a patriotic duty to America and enlisted in the Navy during World War II. Once he returned to civilian life, it was time to focus on himself again, which is what led him to enroll at Harvard. It was while he was there that he got a sense for his own future. It started with him becoming a cartoonist for the Harvard Lampoon, and then its president. He decided to give acting a try and became a part of Harvard's Hasty Pudding theatrical show, and that was it. His fate was sealed. The reaction from the audience turned acting into his true calling. He also realized that he could make his looks, which members of the media would later describe as lanky and lantern-jawed, work for him. And it absolutely did. Where others may have doubted, Fred pushed ever onward, and who could argue with the results? By the early 1950s, he was actually on Broadway, in shows like Mrs. McThing, Love's Labor Lost, and The Frogs of Eternity. But that wasn't enough. So he began making guest appearances on different anthology and episodic TV shows. And just to prove his point, he co-starred with Marlon Brando in the feature film On the Waterfront. Despite all that success, Fred wasn't yet a household name, so in a move to make sure Hollywood knew who he was, he starred in the 1961 sitcom Car 54, Where Are You?, playing Officer Francis Muldoon.
It's not that I'm afraid of girls, it's just that, well, what? Look at me. I'm 6'6". And 5'6" of me is face.
This show is a satire of police dramas, and saw him co-star with Joe E. Ross and Al Lewis, who would eventually join him on The Munsters in the role of Grandpa. During the show's production, Fred provided a bit of insight into himself when he wrote a guest column for the Pittsburgh Press, where he was contrasting himself with co-star Joe E. Ross. He viewed Joe as an entertainer, while Fred thought of himself as an actor. The distinction? Joe could just be himself and put everything out there. As to Fred, he wrote, "If I had to stand up in front of strangers and be Fred Gwynne, I'd be immobilized by embarrassment." It was obvious that if he was going to present himself to the public, it needed to be in the form of acting. The Munsters made its debut in 1964, and it's probably best described as the offspring of the old Universal horror movies and the Donna Reed show. In it, Fred's Herman featured an amazing duplication of the makeup that had turned Boris Karloff into Frankenstein's monster in films from the 1930s. It wasn't an easy role physically for Fred to play. Despite his height, they used platform shoes to bring him up to about 7 feet, and Herman's padded outfit weighed about 50 pounds. On top of that, there was the time spent each morning applying all that makeup. But whatever the challenges, the bottom line is, the audience fell in love with Herman Munster, an all-American dad that loved his family, worked at a funeral home each day, and did the best he could to get through life.
You can be black or yellow or white, it doesn't matter. What does matter is the size of your heart and the strength of your character.
On top of that, Fred added his boisterous, infectious laugh, which only strengthened Herman's appeal. At the time, one reviewer commented, "Watching his sporadically animated mannerisms, one is reminded of TV's Mr. Ed enmeshed in deep conversation, punctuated with the facial pantomimes of Jerry Lewis. Not too many people have been described as a mix of those two." Because it's never been off the air thanks to reruns, people may not realize that The Munsters only ran for 2 seasons. It wrapped things up in 1966, and if Fred had his way, he never would have looked back, which had been a guiding principle in his life anyway. But there's another reason that he wanted to leave that period of his life behind. While he was first embarking on his acting career, Fred had married socialite Jean Renard in 1952, and together they had 5 children. The youngest was named Dylan, who was born in 1962. Tragically, less than a year later, Dylan drowned in the family pool. One can only imagine the personal pain and devastation that this must have caused Fred, Jean, and Dylan's siblings. He would barely talk about the past, choosing again to move ever forward. Not that the rest of the world was willing to let him do so. With every year the Munsters aired in reruns, its popularity only grew, and so did the connection between Fred and Herman, not only in the eyes of the audience, but in Hollywood casting departments and the office of producers as well.
We can't help a young man up the ladder of success. We're pretty sorry excuses for human beings.
Acting, the thing that he loved so much, had become something of a curse. Fred did work, scoring roles in TV movies and features, but usually as a supporting player. It was here where the stage really came in and kept him employed as an actor, as he worked in regional productions across the country. There was a return to Broadway in a Texas trilogy, and he did go into audition for the fatherly role of the sitcom Punky Brewster. But Herman Munster more or less forced him out when the director referred to him as Herman rather than Fred.
I can't do anything right.
Like he dealt with his father's death, Fred always found solace in his art. He once said that when he'd get home from an acting gig, he would put on old clothes, enter the home studio, and work on a sculpture. He admitted that he didn't make much money that way, but he had the inner satisfaction of being non-commercial. Fred, tired of looking for someone to say he'd passed an audition, began writing and illustrating a series of children's books. Ironically, The Curse of Herman Munster, the thing that in Fred's mind had derailed what was such a promising career, actually came to his rescue. In the 1980s, Nick at Night began rerunning many of the classic shows from the 1950s and 60s, including The Munsters. Even more people fell in love with it, but the difference this time is that many of the kids who watched it during its original run were now executives, welcoming the opportunity to work with one of their childhood heroes. Fred began finding himself in demand as a character actor. He was cast in a number of TV movies and films like Fatal Attraction and Stephen King's Pet Sematary.
How's your cat nose?
Jelly's cat.
No. It's your cat now.
Which had critics praising the nuance of his performances, as though they were recognizing the true depths of his talent for the first time. Everything culminated with My Cousin Vinny, the 1992 film which had him playing a Southern judge named Chamberlain Haller. And Fred absolutely had the audience in the palm of his hand, with his every interaction with Joe Pesci's Vinny Gambini, especially Fred's confused repeating of Joe's word youts rather than youths.
To what?
What?
Did you say youts?
Yeah, 2 youths.
What is a ute?
Well, youths entered the popular vernacular, and in those moments, Fred opened himself up to a whole new generation of fans. The irony is that while it seemed he'd finally put Herman Munster to rest, as it turned out, the Honorable Judge Chamberlain Haller was his final role. But at least it was a personally triumphant one. In his private life, he and Jean Renard divorced in 1980, with him marrying Deborah Falter 8 years later. On July 2nd, 1993, just shy of his 67th birthday, Fred died of complications from pancreatic cancer. While nearly 30 years have passed since that date, we've never forgotten Fred Gwynne or the joy that his performances, and yes, especially Herman Munster, brought us. When you consider how many actors are gone and pretty much forgotten, that sort of immortality, even Fred Gwynne himself would have to agree, is not a bad thing. I'm Retro Ed. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll see you next time. And please don't forget to like this video and subscribe.